Royal Guard Story. Part 1. The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestone courtyard of Buckingham Palace as tourists gathered behind the metal barriers. Among them stood Sarah Mitchell, a tired-looking woman in her early 30s, holding the hand of her 8-year-old son, Tommy. The boy's bright blue eyes sparkled with wonder as he watched the famous red-uniformed guards standing perfectly still at their posts. Tommy was different from other children. Born with Down syndrome, he saw the world through innocent eyes that found magic in the smallest things. His fascination with the Royal Guards had begun months ago when he saw them on television. He would spend hours drawing pictures of the tall, serious men in their red coats and black hats, telling his mother stories about how they protected the Queen. Sarah had saved for months to bring Tommy to London. As a single mother working 2 jobs, money was always tight, but she wanted to give her son this one special moment. She watched as Tommy pressed his face against the cold metal barrier, his breath creating small clouds in the chilly air. The boy began waving enthusiastically at the nearest guard, a tall man with kind eyes barely visible beneath his bearskin hat. "Hello, Mr. Guard," Tommy called out in his distinctive voice. Several tourists turned to look, some smiling at the child's enthusiasm, others whispering among themselves. The guard, whose name was Sergeant James Morrison, had been serving in the Queen's Guard for over 5 years. He had seen thousands of tourists, heard countless shouts and calls, but something about this child's pure joy touched something deep inside him. However, protocol was strict. Guards were not supposed to acknowledge the public or break their stoic stance under any circumstances. Tommy continued his one-sided conversation with the guard, telling him about his drawings and how he thought being a guard must be the most important job in the world. His mother gently tried to quiet him, explaining that the guards couldn't talk while they were working, but Tommy's enthusiasm couldn't be contained. As the crowd grew larger, other tourists began to take notice of the special interaction unfolding before them. Some pulled out their phones, sensing that something unusual was happening. The other guards in the courtyard remained perfectly still, but there was an almost imperceptible tension in the air, as if everyone was holding their breath. What nobody knew was that Sergeant Morrison had a younger brother with special needs back home in Wales. The child's innocent words and genuine admiration were stirring, memories and emotions he had carefully tucked away during his years of military service. The guard's training told him to remain motionless, but his heart was beginning to tell him something entirely different. Tommy suddenly reached into his small backpack and pulled out a crumpled piece of paper. It was one of his drawings of a royal guard, complete with crooked lines and bright crayon colors. He held it up toward the guard, his face beaming with pride. "I made this for you, Mr. Guard," Tommy announced loudly enough for everyone nearby to hear. "My mummy says you protect everyone, so you must be very brave." The drawing fluttered slightly in the morning breeze as Tommy continued to hold it up. Sarah felt tears forming in her eyes, knowing how much effort her son had put into that simple picture. She also felt embarrassed by the attention they were drawing, aware that some people were staring not with admiration, but with the uncomfortable looks she had grown accustomed to over the years. The moment stretched on, with the guard staring straight ahead and Tommy still holding up his drawing with unwavering hope. Other tourists began to murmur, some encouraging the guard to acknowledge the child, others commenting on the strict rules that prevented any interaction. Little did anyone know that this simple gesture from a special child was about to set in motion a series of events that would not only touch the hearts of everyone present but would also challenge the very traditions that had stood unchanged for generations. The tension in the courtyard was becoming unbearable. Tommy had been holding up his drawing for nearly 10 minutes, his small arms beginning to shake from the effort, but his determination never wavering. Sarah could see the confusion in her son's eyes as the guard remained motionless, and her heart ached for him. Sergeant Morrison was fighting an internal battle unlike any he had ever experienced. His military training screamed at him to maintain position, to ignore the distraction, to uphold the centuries-old tradition that demanded absolute stillness from the Queen's Guard. But the innocent face of the child before him reminded him so powerfully of his own brother, Michael, who had struggled with autism and had always looked up to James with the same pure admiration. Other guards in the courtyard began to notice the situation. Corporal William Davies, stationed near the main gate, could see his colleague's slight tension in his shoulders. Lance Corporal Roberts, positioned across the courtyard, had also become aware of the extraordinary moment unfolding. These men had served together for years, and they could read each other's emotions even through their stoic facades. The crowd of tourists had grown significantly. Word was spreading through the groups of visitors that something special was happening. People were pulling out phones and cameras, sensing that they might be witnessing something unprecedented. A few elderly tourists began quietly encouraging Tommy, their own hearts touched by his persistence and innocence. "Keep trying, love," whispered an elderly woman from Scotland. "Sometimes good things come to those who wait." Tommy's mother knelt down beside him, gently placing her hand on his shoulder. "Tommy, sweetheart, maybe we should move on to see other parts of the palace," she suggested softly, trying to save her son from further disappointment. But Tommy shook his head vigorously. "No, Mummy, he will like my picture. I know he will. Guards are good people, and good people like pictures." His simple logic and unwavering faith in human kindness left Sarah speechless. Meanwhile, inside the palace walls, Captain Elizabeth Hartwell was making her routine rounds when she noticed the unusual gathering in the courtyard. As the commanding officer responsible for the guard detail that day, she had been trained to handle all sorts of situations, but nothing had prepared her for what she saw through the window. The captain watched as the small boy continued his patient vigil, holding up his artwork with such hope and determination that it brought an unexpected lump to her throat. She had 2 children of her own, and could imagine how crushing it would be for them to face such seeming indifference from someone they admired. Captain Hartwell made a decision that would surprise everyone, including herself. She quietly made her way out to the courtyard, approaching the situation with careful steps. Her presence immediately caught the attention of the guards, who recognized her authority but wondered what she intended to do. As she moved closer, she could see the drawing more clearly. It was a child's interpretation of a royal guard, drawn with obvious care and love. The figure stood tall and proud with a big smile on his face and a heart drawn on his chest. At the bottom, in shaky letters, were the words, "Thank you for keeping us safe." The captain felt something shift inside her chest. This wasn't just about protocol anymore. This was about the very essence of what the Royal Guards represented: service, protection, and dedication to the people they served. Here was a child who understood that mission better than many adults ever would. She approached Sergeant Morrison and whispered something so quietly that only he could hear. The guard's eyes widened slightly, and for the first time since taking his position that morning, he looked directly at his commanding officer. She nodded once, giving him a look that conveyed both permission and understanding. What happened next would be talked about for years to come. Sergeant Morrison slowly, deliberately began to move. The crowd fell completely silent as they realized they were witnessing something that went against every expectation they had about the stoic, unmoving guards. Tommy's face lit up like the sun as he saw the guard acknowledge him for the first time. The boy's joy was so pure and immediate that several people in the crowd began to tear up. Sarah covered her mouth with her hand, hardly believing what she was seeing. Sergeant Morrison took one careful step forward, then another. The sound of his boots on the cobblestones seemed to echo through the suddenly silent courtyard. Every tourist, every guard, every palace staff member who happened to be watching held their breath as this unprecedented moment unfolded. Tommy's eyes grew wide with wonder as the tall guard approached him. The boy had dreamed of this moment for months, but the reality was even more magical than anything he had imagined. His hands trembled with excitement as he continued to hold up his drawing, his face glowing with pure happiness. When Sergeant Morrison reached the barrier, he did something that would be remembered forever. He slowly, with great ceremony, removed his bearskin hat and placed it carefully on the ground beside him. His actions were deliberate and respectful, showing honor not just to the child but to the moment itself. "Good morning, young sir," the sergeant said in his deep Welsh accent, his voice carrying clearly across the courtyard. "I understand you have something very special to show me." Tommy was so overwhelmed with joy that for a moment he couldn't speak. He just stood there, looking up at this towering figure who had finally acknowledged him. Sarah wiped tears from her eyes, watching her son experience what might be the happiest moment of his young life. I made this for you," Tommy finally managed to say, his voice shaking with emotion. "Because you protect everyone, and that makes you a hero." Sergeant Morrison carefully took the drawing from Tommy's small hands, studying it with the same attention he would give to official military documents. "This is remarkable work," he said seriously. "I can see you put a lot of care into this. The attention to detail is impressive." Tommy beamed at the praise. "I drew a heart on your chest because guards have big hearts," he explained earnestly. "My mummy told me that people who protect others have the biggest hearts of all." The sergeant looked down at the drawing, then at Tommy, then at Sarah, who was watching with tears streaming down her face. "Your mummy is absolutely right," he said. "And I can tell you have a very big heart, too." What happened next surprised everyone even more. Sergeant Morrison carefully folded the drawing and placed it in his uniform pocket, right over his heart. "I will keep this with me," he told Tommy. "It will remind me why what we do here is so important." The crowd began to applaud, but the sergeant raised his hand gently. "There's more," he said, looking directly at Tommy. "Would you like to see something special?" Tommy nodded enthusiastically, and the sergeant began to explain the details of his uniform, the significance of each element, and the history behind the traditions. He spoke in simple terms that Tommy could understand, but with such respect for the child's intelligence that everyone listening was deeply moved. Captain Hartwell watched from a distance, knowing she had made the right decision. She had risked her career by allowing this breach of protocol, but seeing the pure joy on the child's face and the humanity in her sergeant's actions confirmed that some things were more important than rigid rules. Other guards in the courtyard began to shift slightly, not breaking their positions but showing subtle signs that they were deeply affected by what they were witnessing. Corporal Davies found himself thinking of his own nephew, while Lance Corporal Roberts remembered his younger sister, who had always looked up to him with similar admiration. Tommy listened to every word with rapt attention, asking simple but thoughtful questions that showed his genuine interest and understanding. "Do you ever get scared?" he asked at one point. Sergeant Morrison considered the question seriously. "Sometimes," he admitted. "But do you know what helps me when I'm scared?" Tommy shook his head. "I think about all the good people like you and your mummy who believe in what we do. That makes me brave." The conversation continued for several more minutes, with Tommy gaining confidence and asking more questions. Sarah watched in amazement as her son, who was often shy around strangers, blossomed under the guards' patient attention and genuine respect. But this magical moment was only the beginning. What none of them knew was that other guards had been watching, and they were about to do something that would turn this single act of kindness into something truly extraordinary. As Sergeant Morrison continued his conversation with Tommy, something remarkable began happening across the courtyard. Corporal Davies, who had been watching the entire interaction, made a decision that would surprise even himself. He began walking toward the group, his boots clicking rhythmically on the stones. The tourists turned in amazement as a second guard broke protocol and approached them. Corporal Davies had served in Afghanistan before joining the Queen's Guard, and he had seen enough of the world's darkness to recognize something precious when he saw it. Tommy's pure spirit reminded him why he had chosen to serve in the first place. "Good morning, Tommy," Corporal Davies said, having heard the boy's name during the conversation. "Sergeant Morrison told me about your excellent artwork. I wonder if you might like to learn about our ceremonies." Tommy looked between the two guards with wonder, hardly able to believe that not one but two of his heroes were talking to him. "Yes, please," he exclaimed, clapping his hands together. What followed was unlike anything that had ever happened in the history of the Queen's Guard. The two soldiers began demonstrating some of their ceremonial movements, explaining each step to Tommy with patience and respect. They showed him how they marched, how they held their rifles, and the significance of their precise movements. Sarah watched in disbelief as more guards began to notice what was happening. Rather than reporting the breach of protocol, they seemed to be drawn by the same magnetic quality that had affected the first two soldiers. Lance Corporal Roberts left his position and joined the growing group, followed by two more guards from other areas of the courtyard. Captain Hartwell realized that what had started as one small act of kindness was becoming something much larger. Instead of trying to stop it, she found herself coordinating the unprecedented event, ensuring that security was maintained while allowing this magical moment to continue. "Would you like to try marching like a guard?" Sergeant Morrison asked Tommy. The boy nodded eagerly, and the guards formed a small formation around him. They taught him the basic steps, counting out the rhythm and encouraging him as he tried to match their movements. Tommy's coordination wasn't perfect due to his condition, but his enthusiasm more than made up for any technical difficulties. The crowd of tourists had grown enormous. Word was spreading through London that something incredible was happening at Buckingham Palace. People were sharing videos on social media, and news outlets were beginning to take notice. But for Tommy, none of that mattered. He was living his greatest dream. "You're a natural," Corporal Davies told him as Tommy successfully completed a short marching sequence. "With practice, you could be an excellent guard." Tommy's face glowed with pride at the compliment. He turned to his mother, who was crying openly now, overwhelmed by the kindness these men were showing her son. "Mummy, did you hear? I could be a guard." Sarah nodded, unable to speak through her tears. She had spent years worrying about Tommy's future, wondering if he would ever be accepted and valued by others. Watching these distinguished soldiers treat her son with such respect and dignity was healing wounds she didn't even know she carried. The demonstration continued for nearly an hour. The guards taught Tommy about the history of their uniforms, the significance of their duties, and the honor that came with serving the crown. They answered every question he asked with seriousness and respect, never talking down to him or treating him as anything less than an equal. During this time, palace staff members began emerging from the building to witness the extraordinary scene. Kitchen workers, administrative personnel, and even senior officials found reasons to step outside and observe what was happening. The story was already spreading through the palace, with people calling their colleagues to come and see. Tommy's energy never flagged throughout the entire experience. He absorbed every detail, asked thoughtful questions, and participated with complete joy. The guards found themselves genuinely enjoying the interaction, remembering why they had been drawn to service in the first place. But perhaps the most touching moment came when Tommy suddenly looked serious and asked, "Do you think the Queen would like my drawing too?" The guards exchanged glances, and Sergeant Morrison knelt down to Tommy's level. "I think," he said carefully, "that the Queen would be very impressed by your artwork and very proud of the kind young man you are." What none of them knew was that someone very important had been watching from a palace window, and Tommy's innocent question was about to be answered in a way that would exceed even his wildest dreams. High above the courtyard, behind the elegant windows of Buckingham Palace, someone had indeed been watching the entire extraordinary scene unfold. Private Secretary Sir Edward Mills had initially approached the window to check on what appeared to be an unusually large crowd gathering below. What he witnessed instead was something that would change the course of his day entirely. Sir Edward had served the royal household for over 20 years, managing countless official events and ceremonies. He had seen dignitaries from around the world, handled matters of state, and coordinated some of the most important moments in recent royal history. But watching the guards spontaneously honor this special child touched something deep in his experienced heart. He quickly made his way to another office, where he found Lady Catherine Pemberton, one of the senior royal staff members, also watching the scene below with obvious emotion. "Have you ever seen anything like this?" she whispered. "Never," Sir Edward replied quietly. "And I've been here through 3 decades of service." They watched as Tommy attempted to salute the guards, his small hand not quite reaching the proper position, but his effort absolutely perfect in its sincerity. The guards returned his salute with full military precision, treating him as if he were a visiting dignitary. Lady Catherine made a decision that would surprise everyone, including herself. "Edward," she said, "I think we need to make a phone call." Within minutes, she was speaking quietly into her phone, explaining the situation to someone very important indeed. The conversation was brief but significant, and when she hung up, she was smiling in a way that suggested something wonderful was about to happen. Back in the courtyard, Tommy was experiencing what felt like the best day of his entire life. The guards had taught him proper military terminology, shown him how to inspect equipment, and even let him try on one of their ceremonial helmets, which was so large it nearly covered his entire head. "I look like a real guard now," Tommy announced, struggling to see from under the enormous bearskin hat. The tourists were laughing and taking pictures, but there was nothing mocking about their response. Everyone present seemed to understand they were witnessing something pure and beautiful. The guard's genuine affection for Tommy was evident in every interaction, and his joy was absolutely infectious. Sarah had stopped trying to contain her tears. She had never seen her son so confident, so valued, so purely happy. These men, who could have easily ignored Tommy or asked him to move along, had instead chosen to make him feel like the most important person in the world. Sergeant Morrison was explaining the significance of the guard's rifle when a palace aide appeared at the courtyard entrance. The young woman approached Captain Hartwell and whispered something that made the captain's eyes widen with surprise. Captain Hartwell walked over to the group with an expression that mixed amazement with careful professionalism. She approached Tommy and knelt down to his eye level, speaking in a gentle but official tone. "Tommy," she said, "I have been asked to give you a very special message. Someone very important has been watching from the palace windows and would like to meet you." Tommy looked confused. "Someone important?" The captain smiled. "Someone who lives here in the palace and who thinks your drawing is quite remarkable." Sarah's heart began beating faster as she realized what might be happening. The tourists around them began whispering excitedly, phones appearing everywhere as people sensed that this already extraordinary day was about to become truly historic. "Would you like to come inside the palace?" Captain Hartwell asked Tommy. The boy's mouth fell open. He looked at his mother, then at the guards, then back at the captain. "Inside the real palace? Where the Queen lives?" "Yes," the captain confirmed. "Inside the real palace." Tommy turned to Sergeant Morrison, his eyes wide with wonder and a touch of nervousness. "Will you come with me? I might get scared without my guard friends." Sergeant Morrison looked at Captain Hartwell, who nodded her approval. "It would be our honor to escort you," he said formally. What happened next would become one of the most talked about moments in modern royal history. The guards formed an honorary escort around Tommy and Sarah, and together they began walking toward the palace entrance. The crowd of tourists watched in complete silence, understanding they were witnessing something truly extraordinary. As they approached the massive doors of Buckingham Palace, Tommy reached up and took Sergeant Morrison's hand. "Are you sure it's okay for someone like me to go inside?" he asked quietly. The sergeant squeezed his hand gently. "Tommy," he said, "places like this were built for people exactly like you. People with good hearts who make the world better just by being in it." The doors opened and together they stepped inside, not knowing that they were about to meet someone who would ensure that Tommy's story would be remembered forever. The interior of Buckingham Palace was even more magnificent than Tommy had imagined. His eyes were wide with wonder as they walked through corridors lined with portraits of kings and queens, their footsteps echoing softly on the polished floors. Sarah held his hand tightly, still hardly believing this was really happening. Lady Catherine Pemberton met them in the grand hallway, her warm smile immediately putting Tommy at ease. "Hello, Tommy," she said kindly. "I'm Lady Catherine, and I've heard wonderful things about your drawing and your interest in our guards." Tommy looked up at her shyly, but managed to say, "Thank you, ma'am. Your house is very pretty." Lady Catherine laughed gently. "Thank you. Now there's someone very special who would like to meet you. She's been watching from her window and was quite impressed by what she saw today." They were led to an elegant sitting room with tall windows overlooking the gardens. The room was decorated with beautiful furniture and portraits. But Tommy's attention was immediately drawn to the small figure seated in a comfortable chair near the window. Queen Elizabeth II, despite her advanced age, sat with perfect posture and a gentle expression. Her eyes sparkled with interest as she watched Tommy enter the room. At 99 years old, she had met world leaders, celebrities, and dignitaries from every corner of the globe. But there was something special about this moment that touched her deeply. "Your Majesty," Lady Catherine said formally, "may I present Tommy Mitchell and his mother, Sarah." Sarah immediately attempted a curtsy, having quickly Googled proper royal etiquette on her phone during the walk through the palace. Tommy, not quite understanding the formal protocol, simply waved enthusiastically. "Hello, Your Majesty, Queen," he said cheerfully. "I saw you on television once." The Queen's face lit up with genuine delight. "Hello, Tommy. I understand you've made quite an impression on my guards today. They tell me you're quite the artist." Tommy nodded eagerly and reached into his backpack, pulling out another folded piece of paper. "I have another drawing. I made it for you yesterday, but I didn't think I would ever get to give it to you." He unfolded the paper to reveal a drawing of the Queen herself, complete with crown and royal robes. It was unmistakably the work of a child, but the care and attention to detail were remarkable. At the bottom in Tommy's careful handwriting were the words, Thank you for being our queen." The queen accepted the drawing with the same ceremonial care that Sergeant Morrison had shown earlier. She studied it carefully, her expression growing more moved with each detail she noticed. "This is absolutely wonderful, Tommy," she said sincerely. "I can see that you put a great deal of thought and care into this. The crown is particularly well done." Tommy beamed with pride. "I looked at lots of pictures to make sure I got it right. Mummy helped me with the spelling." "Well, you both did an excellent job," the queen replied. She turned to Sarah. "You should be very proud of your son. The guards tell me he showed remarkable patience and kindness today." Sarah felt tears forming again. "Your Majesty, I can't thank you enough for this. Tommy has admired the guards for so long, and what they did today, what you're doing now, it means everything to him." The queen nodded understandingly. "Sometimes the most important moments are the unexpected ones. Today your son reminded all of us why we serve. What happened next would become legendary." The queen stood up and walked over to her desk, returning with an official piece of royal stationery. She sat down and began writing something in her careful handwriting. "Tommy," she said as she wrote, "I would like to give you something special. This is an official letter from me to you, thanking you for your drawings and for reminding us all what true service means." She signed the letter with her full signature and handed it to Tommy, who accepted it with reverent care. "This is for me to keep forever?" he asked. "Forever," the queen confirmed. But she wasn't finished. The queen walked to a cabinet and retrieved a small, beautifully wrapped box. "This is something else I'd like you to have," she said, presenting it to Tommy. Inside the box was a special commemorative pin featuring the royal coat of arms, along with a small certificate declaring Tommy an honorary friend of the Royal Guard. It wasn't an official title, but it was signed by the queen herself. Tommy looked at the pin, then at the queen, then at the guards who had been standing quietly nearby. "Does this mean I'm part of your team now?" he asked. Sergeant Morrison stepped forward. "It means you're part of our family, Tommy, and families look after each other." The queen spent another 20 minutes with Tommy asking about his life, his interests, and his dreams. She listened to every answer with genuine interest, treating him with the same respect she would show any important visitor. As their visit came to an end, Tommy suddenly looked serious. "Your Majesty," he said, "I want to tell you something important." "What's that, Tommy?" "You have the kindest guards in the whole world. They made me feel special today, and I think that means you must be very kind too." The queen smiled, and for a moment her formal composure softened completely. "Thank you, Tommy. That might be the nicest compliment I've ever received." 6 months later, Tommy returned to Buckingham Palace for the changing of the guard ceremony. This time he was wearing a small replica guard uniform that had been specially made for him, complete with a miniature bearskin hat. When Sergeant Morrison spotted him in the crowd, he gave Tommy a barely perceptible wink. The story of Tommy and the Royal Guard spread around the world, inspiring countless acts of kindness and reminding people that sometimes the most important protocols are the ones written in our hearts. The Guard's willingness to break tradition for one special child showed that true service comes not from rigid rules, but from compassion, understanding, and the recognition that every person deserves dignity and respect. Tommy kept the Queen's letter and pin in a special place in his room, but what he treasured most was the memory of the day when a group of remarkable men showed him that heroes really do exist, and sometimes they wear red coats and tall black hats.